So hello everyone. I think we'd like to get started. If those people who are standing up could go ahead and take a seat. I'm still kind of getting used to this one-directional microphone. So I'm Mike Fetters. I'm a member of the Center for Japanese Studies and also professor of family medicine and director of the Japanese Family Health Program, which is here in Michigan. For 20 years, the program has been delivering linguistically and culturally sensitive care to the Japanese population here in Southeast Michigan. We have today, in addition to our panelists, Dr. Alan Teo. Where'd you go, Dr. Alan? There he is. Alan was central to proposing this event, and we've been working together with CJS, the Japan Business Society of Detroit, as well as the Consulate General. And I do want to take a quick moment to give a special thanks to the entire team of helpers. There were a ton of people that really helped to bring this all together, from the Center for Japanese Studies, from Family Medicine, and also from Oregon Health and Science University. So the event today is the launch of a 3-day series of events that are addressing suicide prevention. And today we're really launching this series of events by having a discussion about the socio-cultural context of suicide in Japan. Our event tomorrow on Friday will feature the extremely moving documentary Saving 10,000 by Renee Duignan. And by the way, it's in kind of a mix of Japanese and English, but there are bilingual subtitles. So you'll be able to get the whole thing, regardless if you're bilingual or not. But that will then be followed by a short educational/discussion activity, and then there will be additional panelists, some overlapping with today, some different panelists as well, that will reflect on Renee's very powerful message. Following that, on Saturday, that event is going to be conducted in English. On Saturday, we're doing a community outreach event, which will be conducted in Japanese. If anyone is interested in coming to that, that's event 3 up here on this sheet. And that will be the same format, other than the fact that it will be done in Japanese. So I just want to very briefly, we have bio sketches up. We have lots of folks who have things to say today, so I'm just going to give the most terse of introductions. But first we'll have Jennifer Robertson, who's professor of anthropology and history of art. She'll be speaking first. And then we'll have Professor Jonathan Zwicker, who's in Japanese literature and also the director of the Center for Japanese Studies. Denise St. Arnault, a professor of nursing and also a medical anthropologist and a registered nurse. And then finally we have Dr. Kiyoshi Sano, family physician, who's also a former faculty member of the family medicine department and is currently an adjunct clinical assistant professor as well. So the plan is to have each speaker present, and then have the next speaker present, and then we'll have an open discussion at the end. I just wanted to make one reminder that you have received a 2-part survey, and we're asking you to do the first part now. Leave it stapled together. If you took it apart and unstapled it or pulled it apart, we're hoping that you'll be able to actually staple it back together, and we're getting a stapler to put that back together with. And we do acknowledge that some people may have to leave early for the 1 o'clock hour, because we know classes start and that sort of stuff. Even if you do leave early, we hope that you'll be able to complete that and drop it in the box right there, sort of on the right. There's sort of a clear black box there where you'll be able to add that in. So without further ado, Professor Roberts.
Are you going to bring my testing? Great. Everybody hear me okay? Yes. Super. That's not okay. Oh, okay, great. Okay, so I've been asked to give the lead paper, and what I'm going to do is kind of set the stage for what is going to be a very broad spectrum approach to looking at Japanese suicide. And many of you are familiar with suicide because it's treated by outsiders and by many Japanese alike as a national allegory, or as one anthropologist has said, a cultural predisposition. And this equation of Japanese culture with an aesthetic of suicide or death is a largely literary and theatrical motif, one especially associated with the pre-modern samurai class. And it's been a motif that has been embellished and exploited during World War II in the form of the kamikaze, or the tokubetsu kogekitai, the tokkotai, the special forces formed in October 1944 as a last-ditch method of attack. Suicide has also been romanticized in movies, as you see here, and also in wartime propaganda posters. Now, the novelist and playwright Mishima Yukio, who had founded his own fascist clique in the post-war period, acted out his own spectacularly romantic idealization of samurai-style suicide in 1970. And he had practiced for this day in many photo shoots and in his short story and film, Patriotism, that you see here. This is a whole sequence of photo shoots that were made of him practicing a ritual suicide. Now, after an abortive attempt to stage a coup d'etat by seizing the headquarters of Japan's National Defense Force, Mishima enacted a ritual suicide by disemboweling himself with a samurai sword. Now, Mishima's splashy suicide shocked the Japanese public at the time, for whom most public acts of suicide in the form of human body accidents, or jishin jiko, take place at a train station. Somebody has thrown themselves in front of a train. And you see here an event that happened just this past October in Tokyo at Nezu Station. Also familiar to the Japanese public are a form of suicide forms of suicide known as inseki jisatsu, or personal responsibility suicide. And the suicide, tragically, in 2007 of Matsuoka Toshikatsu is, a part of this particular genre of suicide. He felt responsible for a financial scandal and paid with his life. Now, suicide is not a thing in itself. It's not a constant global phenomenon that is known by different terms or names at different historical periods in different societies. Statistics tend to be deployed globally, but they don't say much about different cultures and different concepts and interpretations of and attitudes towards suicide. For example, if suicide is defined as the killing of the self, then attention needs to be paid to the social meaning and construction of that self. Is it a singular, independent thing, or a situational, interdependent thing? And this is just for starts. And there's lots of literature on the Japanese self vis-a-vis other kinds of selves. And I'm not going to go into that literature today. I only have about 10 or 15 minutes to talk. So I want to introduce to you the different types of suicide in Japan that tend to get homogenized in statistics and in global categories like age or sex. Basically, there are historically two opposing styles of self-destruction. The Seppuku, often referred to in the English language as harakiri, and even worse as hara-kiri, is a traditional ritual suicide involving, in the pre-modern period, members of the samurai class who wear white and cut their abdomens and then are beheaded by a second, basically, who assists in the suicide. There is also the contemporary jisatsu, or killing the self, often by hanging or drugs or throwing oneself in front of a train. Now, you have to further distinguish between aristocratic suicide and commoner suicide in the pre-modern period. So the aristocratic suicide, the seppuku, was limited largely to members of the samurai class, which was about 8% of the population at the time, and then the joshi shinju, or the love suicides, that were practiced by members of the commoner classes and involved lovers in impossible triangles, for example. And Jonathan Zwicker will be talking more about this mode of suicide in the next presentation. Now, throughout the history of Japan, there has been almost no period when suicide was prohibited by law. The exception was in the early 18th century when a cluster of joshi shinju, or lovers' suicide pacts, was triggered by melodramas written by the playwright Chikamatsu Monzaemon. And you'll hear more about this as well by the next speaker. Now, the government at the time, the shogunate, prohibited joshi shinju in order to prevent these suicides. So if a joshi shinju occurred, a funeral was prohibited. The bodies were left in public for view, at least in Edo, at the base of Nihonbashi Bridge for 3 days. If this was an unsuccessful suicide and the one individual lived, or one died and one survived, the survivor would then be convicted of murder. Now, this is just because there are no laws today prohibiting or making suicide a criminal offense does not mean that suicide is condoned or embraced in Japan. Today, committing suicide is considered to be illegal, but it's not punishable. It's not a criminal offense. Often, it's the case that someone commits suicide by jumping in front of a train. And in that case, a company will often hold the family responsible for any cleanup costs and lost revenue. So it certainly is a great hardship, poses a great hardship for the members of the family who have survived. Assisted suicide is considered illegal in Japan, and anyone found assisting in suicide can be legally punished. So there's a difference between committing suicide and assisting in one's commission of suicide. Now, according to the strict definition of a variety of suicide that is considered to be a cultural expression or a particular Japanese genre of suicide, is a shinju. And this is kind of interesting because it involves the character for a heart-mind and the character for center. So it's a suicide that is motivated by an affective mind or an emotional state. And you have a variety of types of shinju that I have listed for you here in my PowerPoint. Now, according to the strict definition, shinju is an act where more than 2 people commit suicide voluntarily at the same place, at the same time, and for the same purpose. That's the strict definition. Today, although shinju is used, the definition has become a little bit broader and encompasses more conditions. On the one hand, you have that same sort of mutually agreed upon suicide pact, but there's also, the meaning has been extended to include assisted suicide followed by suicide. So somebody assists somebody in their suicide attempt and then follows with suicide. And the third meaning is related to that, but involves the homicide or the murder of someone followed by their own suicide. So shinju has taken on these various other connotations. What's important here is the feelings of oneness involved in those who are involved in this suicide. Formerly, suicides of the shinju sort were committed by people who were close to each other, but now you have a lot of internet-arranged group suicides among strangers, and this is a very new phenomenon in Japan. Shinju has also been classified into some other categories. You have, as a variant of the love death or the mutually consented lover suicide, you have fufu suicide or married couples joint suicide. And then another variant is the oyako shinju, or the parents killing their children and then committing suicide, usually one parent killing the children committing suicide. Interestingly, there is no such term as ko-oya shinju, when a child kills his or her parents and then commit suicide. Although increasingly patricide and matricide are becoming issues for discussion in Japan. Now, oyako shinju has also been classified in various ways. You have boshi shinju involving mothers and children, and this is in the legal literature and also in the anthropological literature distinguished from infanticide. And I can't go into the peculiarities of those distinctions now, but it's important to keep in mind. You also have fushi shinju, or father-children suicide, again distinguished from infanticide, and muri shinju, which is sometimes very recently in headlines involving parent-child headlines, tucked in so that you would find oyako muri shinju. And the muri involves, it recognizes this forced or coerced aspect to the suicide and bears a suggestion of homicide or murder. And this is a very recent addition to many references to oyako shinju. Now, the most prevalent cases of oyako shinju are boshi shinju, in which children who are too young to decide on suicide themselves are killed by their mothers. And this is the most prevalent type of oyako shinju. About 70% of all parent-child shinju involve the mother killing the children. There are very important differences between mothers and fathers killing their children. So in the case of boshi shinju, it's often young mothers in their 20s and 30s who kill their children and then commit suicide. And the children who are most often killed or taken with her are of preschool age. In the case of fushi shinju, or father-child or children suicide, the children are usually older, and the fathers then commit suicide after killing their teenage children. The most common reasons for the boshi shinju tend to be psychiatric disorders, family conflicts, revenge, for example. Let's say a husband has begun philandering, and so the wife will then kill herself and the children to punish him. And those of the father-child or children suicides tend to be undertaken in response to financial problems or physical illness, which is kind of interesting. Now, what's interesting is that many Japanese often show considerable sympathy toward parents who are not able to find any other recourse but to commit suicide with their children. And this is especially the case with the mother. And we can talk a little bit later about perhaps the absence or the lack of widespread knowledge about a psychological vocabulary, for example, or an ability to reflexively analyze one's physical state, or widespread access to counseling, something that I think Dr. Fetters and his colleagues are attempting to address. Paradoxically, it's this very bond between the mother and child that occasions oyako shinju. And the suicidal mother, as I hinted at earlier, cannot bear to leave the child to survive alone. And it's considered to be reprehensible to do so. So the mother would rather kill the child because she believes that no one in the world would ever be able to take care of the child better than she. And the child or the children would be better off dying with her. The mother may not necessarily realize that she's killing another human being, separate from herself, but unconsciously she feels as though she is killing a part of herself. And this is based on the kind of research that legal anthropologists and also psychological anthropologists have conducted in Japan, in Japanese, and in English. So in the psychology of the mother who commits boshi shinju, killing her children is equivalent to actually killing herself. And this is interpreted as a kind of extended or distributed suicide. So it's impossible for her to imagine a world for her children after her death. And this is the kind of suicide that many in Japan are often sympathetic to. And there's a case in Los Angeles that maybe I could talk about during the Q&A. You find, for example, recently, is this not advancing? In October of last year, there was a headline in the Sankei Shimbun oyako muri shinju. So the muri part is was this murder, this woman who was in her 20s, late 20s, drove her car with her 3 children into Osaka Bay, basically. And so there seemed to be now a reconsideration of the sympathy usually given to this kind of suicide. So to conclude, recent interviews with judges, attorneys, and mediators in Japan have revealed a very heightened awareness of the possibility and occurrence now of child abuse in such oyako shinju cases. You know, it's now appearing in the use of muri in reporting on these parent-child suicides. But it may take time to displace the public's preoccupation with the opposite problem. The news is filled not with the possibility of mothers and fathers killing their children, but with children killing their parents. And this is the big sort of social crisis that is addressed in the newspapers today. So the central question with regard to oyako shinju is whether in the long run it will be considered a form of child abuse or not. As long as leaving children to be cared for by others is viewed as irresponsible and unloving, then it's likely that oyako shinju will be seen as positively protective of the children. And this has been a conclusion that one of my colleagues at UCLA, Tammy Bryant, who's a legal anthropologist, concluded in her research on this phenomenon. And finally, I want to end with something more current because, as you'll hear later, the highest suicide rates are among young people in Japan between the ages of 15 and 24. And so the government, which started a suicide prevention campaign in 2007, is now incorporating popular groups like AKB48 and encouraging people, since so many of suicides among youth are created as a result of these impersonal suicide pacts made on the internet among strangers, to become gatekeepers. So gatekeeping, as the copy says here, means looking out for an important someone who you sense is in emotional distress. And at that, I'll turn the panel back over to Jonathan Zwicker, who's going to be talking about literary representations of suicide. Thank you. Oh. You realize that we all have about 40 more minutes we could stay on the topic.
Is this on already? Hi, can you all hear me okay? So as Dr. Fetters mentioned in his introduction, my field of research and teaching is literature, Japanese literature. And I mention this now for 2 reasons, obviously because of the subject of my talk, but also because I don't have a PowerPoint. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. Jennifer actually alluded to some of the themes that I want to talk about today. The idea of national allegory is actually similar to some of the things that I want to talk about. If I had to choose a title for this presentation, which I don't have a title for, it would be something like maybe the metaphorics and anti-metaphorics of suicide in modern Japan. And one of the things that I run up against every year when I teach modern Japanese literature is how important suicide is to understanding the canon of modern Japanese literature in 2 different but somewhat interrelated ways. One is as subject, that is to say a lot of people kill themselves within modern Japanese novels, but then also many of the most important authors ended their lives in suicide. These are not always the same people. So one of the most famous literary suicides, that is to say a suicide represented in a novel, comes in Natsume Soseki's Kokoro. But Soseki doesn't, of course, kill himself. So I want to talk about what I see as 2 trends or themes in the modern canon. One is where suicide is turned into a kind of metaphor by writers, but also the way that suicide of the writers is understood as a kind of metaphor. And then I'll talk about a much smaller aspect of this, which is what I think of as an anti-metaphor, that is to say a resistance to the metaphoricization of suicide on the part of certain authors, which is much less common but maybe a more important way of thinking about suicide. So anyone who's familiar with the broad outlines of modern Japanese literature will know many of the authors that I'll talk about. Going back to the late 19th century, when suicide becomes a metaphor, really, for Japan's encounter with the West, you have famous examples like Kitamura Tokoku in the late 19th century, or the example of Fujimura Misao, who threw himself into the Kegon waterfalls. Both of their suicides are often thought about as people struggling to make sense of the modern world. How do we make sense of this world of Meiji, and ultimately being unable to do that? It's really, I think, in a lot of ways, Soseki's novel Kokoro that has two important suicides in it. The suicide of the figure known as K, followed by the suicide of the figure known as Sensei, where this idea of suicide being a metaphor for Japan's encounter with modernity really takes root. Both these figures, K and Sensei, more or less self-consciously articulate their own suicides as emerging out of the impossibility of being both Japanese and modern simultaneously. And much of the way that suicide is written about up through the post-war into the present deals with that same problem. Suicide becomes then a metaphor for one's struggle with the modern world. One of the most famous examples of this is Akutagawa Ryunosuke, Soseki's closest pupil, who kills himself in 1927. What's particularly interesting, I think, about Akutagawa's case is it contains two kind of elements to it. One is his own understanding of mental health, but what he refers to in his own writing as madness. That is to say, his mother went mad, and he himself felt himself going mad. So he understood that, and he very much talked self-consciously, wrote about the question of inheritance. Is madness inherited? On the other hand, he always also simultaneously tried to understand his own madness as a kind of metaphor. So if one reads his late work like Cogwheels Hagaruma, where the main character sees these spinning gears out of the side of his vision, it becomes, the gears are of course representative of modernity. He sees them when he comes to the city. They recede from view when he goes back home. It becomes a kind of metaphor of somebody struggling with the reality of modern life. And he talks about his own suicide in terms of being haunted by the demons of the fin de siècle, that is to say, the demons that he encounters in the books that he reads, the books coming from the West. So he's kind of perched between these two poles. On the one hand, this sense that his own madness, which eventually results in his suicide, is somehow genetic, pathological almost, on the one hand, and on the other hand, that it's culturally derived, that it has to be made sense of in the context of the history of modern Japan. The last example of this that I'll give, though there are plenty of others, is one that Jennifer briefly referenced, one of the most famous suicides in modern Japanese history, which is, of course, Mishima Yukio killing himself in 1970. As Jennifer suggested, this was done as a spectacle, as a sort of attempted coup d'etat, though to the extent he actually thought he was carrying out a coup d'etat is probably debatable. In fact, the whole notion of something not impacting reality, that is to say, the futility of his act, I think was really front and center in his own mind. I mean, if one reads a work like Yukoku, Patriotism, that Professor Robertson mentioned, one will see the sense of futility is very much an important part of how he's understanding the act. One acts not in order to achieve something, but almost precisely to show that nothing is achievable, and yet one does it anyway. And if you think about his late works like the tetralogy, The Sea of Fertility, it's interesting because the title of the tetralogy, Sea of Fertility, but actually the books are all about infertility, not about fertility. They're about the inability to reproduce, except through reincarnation. So Mishima's suicide was enacted as a kind of metaphor, and it's always been read as a kind of metaphor for, again, this kind of the inability of Japan to reconcile itself with modernity. This is the subject to which Mishima comes back over and over and over again in the tetralogy, and his sense that there's been a kind of failure, that Japan has failed by simply modernizing in sort of a way that mimics the West. So if the metaphor or metaphoricization of suicide is about trying to ascribe meaning to an act of killing oneself, then what exactly do I mean by a kind of anti-metaphorics? There are two examples I want to give for this. One is extremely well known. I think maybe most of you have read this novel, which is Murakami Haruki's Norwegian Wood, a novel that early on in my teaching career I struggled to teach because I couldn't make sense of how suicide functioned in the novel, and then I finally figured out that was the whole point, which I'll explain in a minute. The other is one of Higuchi Ichiyo's short stories, Nigorie, from the late 19th century, which is translated, I think, as Troubled Waters. Nigorie is quite interesting to think about in this context because it avails itself and makes use of Chikamatsu's love suicides. It's a retelling in certain ways. Certainly the end of it's a retelling of love suicides at Amijima, which is the subject of the Shinoda Masahiro film from which Professor Robertson took the image of the commoner suicide. What's really interesting about the end of Nigorie is that instead of a love suicide, what we get is in fact a murder-suicide. What we get is a young woman who's slashed in the back by a jilted lover. But then the people who gossip and create rumors about the suicide begin to incorporate it into the narrative of double suicide. They deny her victimhood, in a sense. And I think part of what Higuchi Ichiyo is exploring and thinking about in a text like this is the inherent sexual violence of this kind of act. The extent to which any of these characters in this traditional drama have any kind of freedom, any kind of choice, and to the extent to which it's always already a coercive situation. So I think very clearly and very importantly, at a moment when Chikamatsu's own literature was being revived and reimagined in the Meiji period, Ichiyo makes this kind of intervention to say we ought not to romanticize these things. We ought to think of them and talk about them for the violence that they are, rather than glorifying them and thinking about them in this kind of narrative context. Okay. The last text that I'll talk about is Norwegian Wood. So what struck me about Norwegian Wood when I first read it, and what made it difficult to teach, is I couldn't understand the role that suicide was supposed to play in this novel. And suicide's a very important part of the novel, right? It begins with suicide, and suicide is kind of hanging over it until the end. And then one day it hit me that that was the whole point, that Murakami was actually refusing to metaphoricize, to allegorize suicide. He wasn't trying to ascribe to it any meaning. He was actually talking about it as a lack of meaning. There's nothing we can fathom about suicide. It's ultimately not understandable. Now, I understand saying that may in certain ways sound like it's going against the whole idea of this event, which is to say we can understand something about suicide. But I actually think that's, in a sense, what he's saying. We can understand things about suicide, but ultimately it becomes something, the meaning of which can never be ultimately understood. It can't be ascribed a larger societal or cultural meaning. It's ultimately something that's deeply personal, and oftentimes the meaning of the suicide dies with the person who commits it, as it does, I think, in that novel and in other novels. I mean, the suicide of Rat, for example, in Wild Sheep Chase is similar in that sense. And I think I wanted to end with Murakami because I think his way of dealing with suicide actually is a really useful thing for us to think about, which is to say, rather than always trying to think about the meaning of suicide, sometimes accepting that it's an act that's unfathomable, especially to those of us who survived the suicide, is maybe part of how we need to think about suicide. Rather than always trying to understand the meaning of it, we sometimes need to simply accept that we can't understand what it's about. And I'll end there.
Yeah, maybe here too.
Okay. I think they like it as close to your mouth as possible.
All right, thanks. All right. And is there a clicker?
I think
Jennifer, do you have a clicker?
Oh. It's is it plugged in there? Yeah. Okay.
Perfect,
So
thank you.
forward, back,
Oh.
pointer, and blank.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Good.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Hi, I am a psych mental health nurse and a medical anthropologist, and I began this work in the early 90s when we did have a mother-child suicide in the community, and the community asked me to help with the psychiatric sort of perspectives on that. My research over the last however many years this has been now involves probably about 75 or 80 interviews with people who are extremely distressed, women who are extremely distressed. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the themes that these women have brought forward to me and my understanding of that. So while this is medical anthropology, for those of you who are interested in anthropology, this is actually what you might call clinical ethnography. That is, I'm listening through a cultural lens and a clinical lens simultaneously. So this is very close to the ground, although it's also cultural. So a couple things I noticed in the literature that I wanted to bring forward before I make my remarks is this idea of causes. You've heard quite a bit about anthropological understandings of causes, but this is more sort of epidemiological. A lot of literature is talking about the correlation between suicide and economic downturn in the 90s, but that literature really is ignoring the fact that actually suicide is the leading cause of death for young men, not men in their 40s and 50s who have just lost a job. Also, it doesn't address things like men who commit suicide after a divorce, which is a really interesting, peculiar phenomena. And suicide is still the leading cause of death for young women 15 to 34. Another thing I want to say from an epidemiological point of view is this, a lot of the literature is talking about trends in suicide and trying to explain what might be causing these increases in suicide. Psychological depression is always remaining at the top of the list, but there's very little describing that depression or how culture and depression link together or are experienced by the people. Losing jobs is absolutely in that list as a possible cause or a cause of an increase. But what I'm interested in is this 34% increase related to this hardships in life. And that's absolutely what comes through in the interviews that I've heard. So I'm going to speak primarily about that. But when they talk about hardships of life, for those of you who want to continue your study in suicide after this event, please look into this idea of modern type depression. There's a lot of primarily literature in newspapers and sort of lay popular literature about this idea of modern type depression. And Dr. Sano is going to be talking a lot about that because it's really a stress, a response to stress. So very similar to what you were saying, the rigors of modern life. But it also relates to what I'm going to refer to. So there's sort of 3 or 4 themes that I'm going to talk about today, and they're linked in the end. So one of them is suffering. So when you're on the ground and you're talking to people who are struggling, from my perspective as a clinical ethnographer, it's pretty hard to use the word depression exactly because we don't exactly know what that means to the person. So the word I've always used is suffering. So what I've done is recruited people who are suffering and then talk to them about what that suffering feels like to them, what it means to them. And in these interviews, what I've seen is this incredible symptom burden. The women I've talked to, where I'm closing in on 100 interviews by now, and these women are crushed by symptoms. And the symptoms are all over the map. They've got, headache and stomach ache, but they're also weak. They can't get up. They can't hold their head up. They're throwing up blood. But also they're drowning in this gigantic amount of meshed feelings that if I try and disentangle them kind of come out to be 3 things: regret, frustration, and loneliness. And that kind of a cluster, all that crushing emotional regret and this physical symptoms makes the person unable to function. So she's sort of drowning in this pressure of symptomology, I guess you'd say. But what I've also heard is that she every morning resolves she's going to try again. And she's going to try harder. Because what does she feel? Regret. Right? She's been trying and it's not working. So what does she do? She resolves to try harder, which of course compounds the suffering. But this suffering, this burden of the suffering, chips away at any possible delight or satisfaction or meaning or gusto, I guess, in life. So she starts to talk about her future as just a series of burden of suffering and trying again to do better, feeling like a failure, feeling frustrated, and then trying again. So it's this cyclical, and what a word that keeps jumping out to me when I read these is also inescapable. So I want to talk a little bit more about regret. I do this thing in the interviews. It's an anthropological technique. It's called a card sort. So we have 46 cards, and the woman who's suffering with her distress will take the cards and she'll lay them out on the table and sort of clump them. You know, here's depression, here's my heart pain, here's my stomach ache. And regret is often set to the side. And it's almost like it's the theme of the story. So this regret's very interesting because people say, oh, yeah, that's just hopelessness, just like in America. I don't think so. Regret is something unbearable. So I'm sorry, I've got a typo there. There is a lot of literature on guilt. There's a lot of literature on shame. There's a huge amount of literature on hopelessness and depression. But there's very little on regret, and that's the theme I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And when I listen to the women, what they tell me is that the regret is related to this dynamic in life. And that dynamic has to do with the sort of twofold expectations. Right? She, as a woman, is expected to fulfill the role, to do right by her family, to enact the role of a good wife, good mother. But on the other hand, in her heart, she wants fulfillment. She wants a self. She wants a life. She wants to do something with this life, for this life to have some meaning, personal meaning for her. Each of these needs is compelling, obviously, but the social expectations take the priority because everybody's watching, right? So the regret is sort of coming at her from both sides. If she meets the one need, she regrets the loss of the other and vice versa. So this regret, again, is this sort of inescapable trap. So failure to do either causes a cycle of regret. Really, there's very little literature on how a Japanese person is going to manage or reconcile these opposing tensions, but some people are talking now about this concept of jiritsu, or mature interdependence. So there is a way to come out of that, but a young woman is not going to know what that is. So you notice when you see these suicide rates, these are very young people. They don't have the skill. They don't have the maturity to sort of figure this out. So this regret seems, in my sense, when I look at these cards, as somehow the root cause of all these physical symptoms and all this incredible distress, and also absolutely inescapable. My research topic actually is not Japanese culture, but help seeking. So what I'm really interested in is how does a person get help when they're suffering? So in my interviews, that's what I have ultimately asked people is, when you feel that, what do you do? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? So we saw in the one slide about the singing group, this idea of exquisite sensitivity, the feeling of others. So there's no doubt that other people in the world of this woman know she's hurting. They know she's suffering, and they know she can't talk about it. But they also can't ask her. So there's a cultural dynamic of asking about suffering directly, or speaking about your suffering directly creates this complication that you just can't do this. So it creates complexity in relationships. Like if I reach out to her and it's unasked for, all of a sudden I've imposed myself on her and suggested that she's not capable. If she asks for help, it imposes a burden on the relationship that could be unacceptable or maybe not be proper, depending on the relationship. Certainly asking for help is a socially sanctioned activity in the first place. It's not something that people tend to do in Japan. And of course, revealing that you're suffering or not functioning can be extremely stigmatized. It can be the beginning of a series of gossip, which could cause the woman being ostracized and actually increase her isolation. So she knows that. So this restriction in help seeking or sharing pain leaves the sufferer maybe with no place to go. So even the small act of sharing how much it hurts is somehow not available. We know that catharsis is useful, right? So you talk to somebody about how much it hurts. But if you have no place to do that, it becomes a trap. And then, of course, if she does seek help, because certainly plenty do, in some small ways or bigger ways, like talking to their doctor or nurse, because it's stigmatized and misunderstood, and a lot of the treatment options are distasteful, it's not something she's probably going to follow through with anyway. So the counseling is probably not something she's interested in, and the medications feel too strong. So again, everything shrinks back to that private moment in the bed when you ruminate about your regret. The last concept that came up, we were sort of reading between the lines in the interviews, and we started talking about meaning. And it was really meaning in life that was maybe not called out exactly, but seemed to be referred to constantly in these interviews. So ikigai, this sense of purpose or life's purpose. So I want you to think about life's purpose from this perspective. If life has no meaning outside of this suffering, which is somehow inescapable because of the social constraints, there's no way to reach out, which would have meaning, but that's closed off. That creates a kind of a sense of, I have no purpose, I have no meaning. That increases the suffering. So it's this cycle again. This unbearable regret, frustration, so that's the frustration component, right? That I'm looking for meaning in my life, and I can't move to get there. And another thing that they don't talk about as much, but I certainly have seen, is this sense of rumination. So it's this sort of circular thinking where you go, oh, suffering, meaning in life, oh my God, I regret, oh, I really want to have some fulfillment, oh man, I can't even manage my house and family, and this sense of personal failure coupled with this physical pain and disability is this inescapable trap. So the last thing I want to say is, as a psych nurse, I've been working in depression my entire career since 1980. And I have to say that this sense of inescapability is a resounding feeling for those people who have tried to commit suicide or who are suicidal. So this idea of being inescapable reminds me of some of the futility that you're talking about. And somehow it's important, and I'm still working on language, it's not the same as hopelessness. So for the American population, I want you to hear, yes, it's hopeless, but it's more futile. It's more inescapable. It's more like the world is black at the social level, and at my ability to engage with that social world. So it's somehow different. It's a different tint. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Put this on there. Can you hear me all right? Good, good. My turn. I'm the last person, right? It'll be 9 minutes now. I don't know. So I have the slides here, and mostly pictures for you to look at. I'm not going to talk much about it. But my intention is that I want you to experience the life in Japan, why the Japanese people really do that, do the suicide, right? Because the background, culture background. Because I want you to really see what I, Japanese, raised there, right? And this one, right? Side one. Ooh, see that? I don't talk much. There you go. This is the 1998. Since 1998, see the number of the suicide, jumped up. 32,800, And then since then, it's over 30,000. Something must have happened, right? Sure, it's 1997 and 8. You can guess. So the economy went down, everything, right? I think that's what it is. And it is probably something, depression, economy, probably have something to do with it. Some modern type depression she was talking about, and it happened. So, but probably before 96, 97, the people might have done a suicide, maybe different reasons. That's probably the culture-based the other people talked about. That's my guess, okay? And why they die, I'm sorry, you can't watch, you can't see this clearly, but the blue, that's health reasons. And then this red is the financial reasons, and then family reasons, and then work-associated reasons, and then boys and girls problem is the light blue, and then school problem is that orange color, and then others. And when you look at male and female, it's kind of hard, but health problems, look at the female, right? 62.8% female suicide because of the health reasons, whatever. But the male, 38.7%. And then when you look at that green, alcohol, financial problems, sure, male gets suffered, right? So the male, mostly alcohol, financial reasons, and the female for the health reasons. I guess those are the major difference. Probably next one is boyfriend-girlfriend problems. Boys suffer more than girls, right? That's kind of interesting. And so when you look at the ages, there's under 20, 20 to 30, 30, 40, 40, up there is 80. And as you can see, majority of the people who commit suicide is right there, 60s. Health problems for the female, financial problem for the male, alcohol. Yeah, it's about time for us to think of for my age. Anyway, so to really 40, 50, 60s, those are the majorities. But nowadays, the Japanese population is really moving up, elderly, more older people. So what you will see in the future will be 70s, 80s. I'm sure the number will go up. And this is when you look at the world. This may not be really up to date, but number one suicide rate is Lithuania. I didn't know that. Japan is at the bottom, 11. Right? Lithuania, Belarus, Russia, Sri Lanka, mostly somebody said cold weather, isn't it? Or Eastern, whatever. So it's really cold, seasonal, affective, whatever, sad. Right? And then this is a interesting thing. Let's see, 20s, right? And there, in last 3 years, young people's suicide really jumped up, but triple, 276% increased. The reason of suicide is failure to obtain job, get job, right? And then now it's so hard to get the job. So because they couldn't get a job, I'm going to die. Right? And then the second one is about 2.5 times bigger than increased than before. That's you're fighting with the parents. Or you don't like them, or they don't love me. No. The parent, right? And then this is the financial problems, and then failure at work, no job. So there's a lot of work associated. Young people, 20-some-year-old, first after graduate college, go to the work, and then they don't want you. Felt so refusal, nothing to do, right? It's so sad. Why they are so fragile? That's next story. But this is one more before that. So older people, older than 60s, the people who commit suicide, number one is family problems. And then younger than 60, alcohol, depressions. Probably they're mostly male here. But here, a lot of family problems. Right? Family problems means I lost my wife when I was 65. I'm lonely. I'm living myself. That kind of thing. Or the fighting. Or the I'm taking care of my wife, 75-year-old, bedridden, and I take care of her, but I'm tired. Or she wants me to kill her, kind of thing. It's really sad. So now, in Japan, right? The slides from now will show the Japanese common life, where I live, where everybody lives, right? A little bit different from America, though. This is general things, the population and so on. So Tokyo is 12 million right now. Okay, this is Japanese house, middle class, I said. Okay, looks like a Western house, right? Right there, I can't see it well, but living room and bedroom up there. The thing is, this is a living room. This is boys or girls is a child room, right? Separated. You have your own room. What a luxury, huh? No, it's not. It's isolation. Okay, so middle class has got the more spaces. So children get their own rooms, good or bad, right? And then this is the low class, I said low, but Japanese life. See that? All people living there and really small. This is reality. This is the reality. I do home visit, mostly like that. Much more garbage there, but anyway. A lot of them like that. See, living alone, right? Will they go out for walk? Will they go out for swimming, exercise? Park nearby? No. So they don't go out. Their knees getting weaker, start hurts, so they don't move. Pretty much bedridden there, right? So getting weaker. Nobody to take care of him. He lost a wife 20 years ago. See, this is the people, really, numbers increasing in Tokyo, big cities. Tokyo used to be a young people's town, but not young anymore, 30, 40 years later. Everybody is single family, but lost a wife. Husband living there, or wife lost a husband, living there alone. Big high-rise Tokyo apartment. When you go there nowadays, it's not young family anymore, though. It's not. It's really like that. It's pretty sad. Let's see. Watching TV like that all day long. And this is urban Japanese life, young people like that. And when I was younger, everybody goes to Tokyo this age to look for the job. There's a whole bunch of jobs there at that time. I go to the college, university there, Tokyo. The population really got bigger. But again, I said 30, 40 years later, it was just like the previous slides. And now this is what the dream of Tokyo is about. College life, everybody like that. You know, nobody knows what this means. It means cheese. Well, it's a V, victory, whoever Churchill said that, right? You know that, right? Nobody knows that. It's so funny. Anyway, so now this is the urban elders. I mentioned that, right? Well, here, look at this guy. Used to be easy writer. a hippie guy, living alone, and a really lonely life like that. And then even if you go to the countryside, same kind of thing, but different situations. See, this old lady's looking at the daughter. Daughter is kind of isolated. There's no communications. And she feels kind of burdened on her, and she feels, I want to go to Tokyo. It's really sad. And so these ladies really, the guy like that is really living alone. It's really sad. I see a lot of them. And now, going back to the children, right? Childhood. This is what the elementary school is like. I did that too. Right? See this one, how to bow. And everybody wears the same hat, same clothes. Okay, this is the culture. This is the culture that's everybody goes through. So your life is molded into a same as others, unified. And that's the natural thing. You don't want to do anything different from others because you stand up. And then the teacher says, no, you can't wear a red hat. Got to be blue. So it's just, you are treated like a robot. So, because I don't really think of, I'm going to wear something different color, I'm going to colorful swimming clothes. No, everybody wears a blue. I want a blue. Why do you wear yellow? You should wear blue. See the peer pressure that way? If you do something different, no. Hey, that's the culture there. See that? This is the high school uniform. Everybody sailor looks good, but actually, see, everybody looks the same. I did that too, middle school, high school. And then even my era, middle school, we have to kind of shave head at that time. I hated it. Anyhow, see? And then this is high school. High school, you have to go, you really expected to go to the college. So you really have to study hard. Right? And then, of course, that is a bully, right? Oh yeah, a lot of, if you are different from others, you are the target. Right? And then mostly those targeted person are not really strong guy like that or varsity sportsman. No, it's more like like that, right? Really weakened personality like that. Those are the target. It's so sad. And then those people are those bullies are so frustrated. They really do whatever they want to do. They put all the energy into the weak person. So he won't come back to you. So this really is happening. Okay, this is the Japanese life. Common life though, I hate to say, but now this is the entrance exam, the college. Right? So this one day will really determine your future. If you enter the big school, famous school, and then you go to the bigger company and then you earn money, your future is there. Really? I don't know. See, like that? You go to the Todai there or whatever, your future goes like that. This is the first day of the company. See that? Everybody wears the same clothes. This is not high school. This is not the school. This is the company's first day. Right? Something is wrong, isn't it? It's all brainwashed. I really feel that way nowadays. Everybody goes either black or dark blue. Recruitment or interview to get the job, there's a recruitment clause. Exactly like that. To hide your individualities. So the interviewer cannot really choose based on the clothes or anything. And then the answers to the one questions, everybody answers the same thing. There's no way to really distinguish this guy better than the other. So what do? I don't know. Depending on maybe he's from Tokyo Daigaku, he's from not. Okay, let's take Tokyo Daigaku. See, eventually that's what they end up with. It's kind of unfortunate. So this is a company, right? So to get into the bigger company, they go to the bigger university, and then they're dreaming of this big company and happy marriage, and then like that, executives. Right? These executives are pretty much the products of those unified school life, university, I'm not criticizing them, okay? I'm not jealous about either. There's a lawyer there and surgeons there. That's the expectation. Good students, good boy, are supposed to do whatever parent says. These are their final goal. Just like that. Or this is the military, but expectation of the family, everything on him. He's going out for war, probably die. But that one, see, she's got all the parents' expectation. Expectation to go to famous school and go to the big company and happy marriage, so and so. In the past, this is the social ranking hierarchy. Samurai on the top. The second is farmer, manufacturer, the merchant. Right? And then samurai is no samurai anymore. Where are they? Government office. That's where the samurai is now. Right? When you go to the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, they are the samurai. Samurai used to work there. So everybody, top school graduates goes to government officials. Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, Okurasho and Monbusho, everybody. But they're not that happy. Anyway, so, and at work, sure, the seniority is the one. Now it's changing to the outcome-based. If you really worked hard and then produce more and your position goes up, if you don't, even if you're a 53-year-old, if you don't produce it, you're not promoted. So you get all sorts of sad things. Oop. And this is high social expectations. This is funny, because since you are Japanese, you should act like na. Since you are father, you should do na. Since you are the leader of the group, you should act like na. All expectations. Since you are the oldest son, you are supposed to take over dad's job. And since you are the doctor, of course, you are supposed to behave like doctor. All the expectations, right? What if you don't match to this? Oh gosh, failure. Japanese personality. Yeah, Japanese is really thorough, perfectionist, a lot of them, because that school life, right? As you looked at saw the pictures, everybody's got to do this, got to do this. Yeah, if you're trained that way, sure, you become perfectionist like that, exact punctual. Gambare. Yeah, work hard. Working hard is good. Sacrificing your wife and children and family, everything. Anyway, so it's adaptation difficulties. Misfitting, right, to the role expected, and mismatch, failure to adapt and unable to act as a role given in the society. Old society has more established role expected. Newer society has less expectations. But old society like Japan, Europe, really heavy expectations. And mismatching, then there is wondering if you should go down or there. This I skip. So okay, this is a house. So suppose you're living here, old house is open, pretty much like that. You don't have your own study room. So as all communications, or you don't have a privacy, but in return, you communicate with others every day. So it has communication skills in that sense. Yeah, like that. But this family probably become like that. But however, you have all family living together. You can communicate with grandma is with the grandchildren, so it's fun. And then this here, isolation. This is how it starts. You're isolated. You do not develop your skills. And if you're a single child, suppose, you do games all day long. You don't talk to anybody. Right? Games are really ruining a lot of young people nowadays. Playing along, right? Their communication skills. And then become teenagers and 20-some-year-old. Isolation, no social skills. That. This is bad picture, isn't it? He's about to, he's lonely, he's about to do something. This is a reality. You got to do something to stop. And I think that's all I would like to say today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so why don't you leave the mic on? And we can have all the panelists come up, please.
Okay.
You just go down there. So this is a new format for us with 4 speakers. So it's probably everybody had probably 4 times as much they would have liked to have said if we could give more time. But thank you for bearing with us in the format. So we heard some really interesting things in terms of sort of thinking through a national allegory, or some of the metaphors, some of the sort of external pieces, but also hearing about what's going on internally. And also thinking about what's happening in contemporary Japanese society in terms of isolation, loneliness. So what we want to do is open it up to see if people have some questions they'd like to have the panelists speak to. Yes.
What role does trauma and abuse play in suicide risk? Adverse childhood events that wasn't really talked too much about, I feel, in this conversation. So I'm wondering.
Do you want to speak to that? Okay.
I
Go
have a
ahead.
comment as well. Yeah, I do
Okay,
too.
so John?
Go ahead. You want to go first?
Well, one of the things we do in those interviews is called a lifeline. And so I'm starting to analyze all the lifelines. And what's interesting is the kind of abuse or trauma that we see is somehow culturally framed. So bullying in preschool and even as early as preschool, but certainly in elementary school, was a theme I saw across probably 50 of the lifelines. Another one that I saw a lot was a loss of a grandparent that was the only one you could talk to. So that loss of that confidant or loss of that close person would be perceived by that person as a trauma. The way that it's framed feels much more like trauma recovery than grief in those interviews. So those were 2 themes that I saw. The other thing I'll say is that in these lifelines, what you see is these dips. And the common theme in those bullying people is then the next failure. Then the next, I got the job and I was bullied. Now I'm in this community and people have ostracized me. So that same sort of recurrent trauma, I guess that's what I would say, social trauma.
And also I've been asked to repeat the question for the recording of the session, which was about early exposures to trauma and how that might have an impact on risk for suicide. Dr. Robertson, Professor
Thank
Robertson.
you. I just wanted to mention I had a much longer paper prepared, and I was going to talk a little bit about youth suicide, and particularly LGBT suicide, which is very high in Japan. And youth are a rising suicide statistic in Japan, particularly males. And it's the only G8 nation where youths outpace elders in the suicide rate, which is important to note. And Japan is also the only country among the advanced post-industrial countries where HIV/AIDS is on the rise. And although Japan is not a homophobic society in a religious sense, like the United States, for example, there is concern in Japan among parents that their children will not reproduce the family, basically. So there's a lot of prejudice toward LGBT youth in the sense that there's a fear that they may not reproduce. And that said, in Japan, it's still the case that the only sanctioned context for procreation is marriage. The only sanctioned context for child raising is marriage. And that may change with the declining birth rate. But you take Israel, for example, and as long as you want to have a child, the state, the university, the business will do everything they can to arrange for that possibility, regardless of your sexuality. But in Japan, and this gets back to your question, youths who don't feel that they're able to tell their parents that they're lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgendered often exchange that information on the internet, are also bullied at school, often through the internet. And they are probably one of the highest risk populations for suicide. Trauma from bullying, trauma from not being able to express openly their sexuality, and of course the oppressive context within which relationships are sanctioned in Japan. So this is going to be an emerging issue, and I think we now have the language to address this. And there are organizations in Japan, I had a whole list on one of my slides for you, that are addressing this very, very new discourse of sexuality in conjunction with suicide.
Thank you, Professor Robertson. I think I saw some other hands. Yes, yeah. So the question was raised about bullying and the rise of suicide in very young children, elementary school level children. Professor
If I
Robertson?
can just say something very quickly, if you look at the most recent statistics on the government websites, and there are a lot of data from 2013, which is the most recent, the reason most kids under 15 die from a disease, basically, not suicide. And so when you say the rise in suicide among youth, or really, elementary school students, you need to put that in comparative perspective. And so you don't see a rise in the statistics per se, but the biggest rise, if you want to track it from 1978, which was most statistics do, is really among youth from 15 to 24, and also in some cases 35. Depends how the statistics are calibrated.
I don't have numbers. However, recently there's many bullies associated with the suicide among middle school age, 12 to 15, and in big cities in Kobe and Tokyo, Osaka area. And I suppose that the elementary school is too young for the kids to recognize or tell, just hold inside. And but I guess the middle school that their bully, the way to bully is probably harsh, more wild, I suppose. I don't have numbers, but there are certainly an increasing number of the middle school or high school level, a lot of them.
So actually, as the MC, I just want to pose a question to the panel. I think a theme that kind of came out is suicide as a responsible resolution in Japan. And so as long as suicide is socially condoned and it's considered it's a responsible response to stress or whatever else troubles one in life, can a difference be made in suicide rates? So I just wanted to pose to the panel, I think you were touching on that, Jonathan, when you were talking about these new elements, these new anti-metaphors. But do we think, what do you have opinion about, is suicide the responsible resolution? And is that something that we just have to say shogunai and we have to accept? Or is this something that could be changed, or is it inevitable? Does anyone want to take that fiery ball?
Can I just say one thing, which is, I think this gets to the importance of narrative, which is how we talk about these things. So if you look at the Higuchi story that I mentioned from if you look at the Higuchi story that I mentioned from 1895, which is about a murder-suicide, what's really quite interesting is that she ends the story by having people talk about it. That is to say, to fit it into culturally acceptable boxes. So he, the guy who murders the woman and kills himself, is talked about as being valiant and doing the right thing, and she is denigrated for not willingly participating in the suicide. So Higuchi is clearly showing the process through which these brute facts of life are being incorporated into culturally sanctioned narratives, but also exposing the role that narrative plays in covering over, violence of various kinds. So I think part of what you're asking is how we tell stories about things, and even on the panel, how we're telling stories about things. I mean, how we maybe use the idea of Ijime to tell stories about Japan, whereas perhaps it's less statistically significant than we may think, but it becomes a way that we think about Japan. Japan is a culture of bullying and so forth. So I think maybe kind of reflecting on the kinds of narratives we ourselves are telling about Japan is part of what we ought to be doing when we think about this.
Yeah, Professor Robertson.
I'll just be quick. First of all, I just wanted to say that suicide is not condoned, but it's sympathized with. So nobody encourages anybody to commit suicide as a resolution, but it's understood if one does. So that's a difference. But with respect to Jonathan's point about narrative, I think, first of all, I'm an anthropologist, so I think it's really important not to confuse literature with ethnography. I mean, there are ways in which you can understand, the fuller context of a suicide situation through literature, but it is an author's liberty that she or he is taking. And I think we need to remember that, because a lot of early work on suicide in Japan by George DeVos, for example, a Berkeley anthropologist, depended on literary accounts and in the movies, and it wasn't based on ethnographic work in the larger society. Two, I just wanted to say that it is almost overwhelmingly the case that individuals who opt to commit suicide, whether they're Mishima Yukio and famous playwrights and novelists, or high school kids or members of the working class, they leave a note. And in the case of more literary types of individuals, that death note may take the form of a poem. But there's usually a note. In fact, they're so prevalent that it's even a recognized literary genre in Japan. You can buy published volumes of suicide notes that were left behind. And again, as a show of sincerity about the precipitating causes or occasioning forces behind the choice to basically kill oneself.
It's interesting that we're talking about narrative, because as a psych nurse, I'm trying to figure out how do I help this population, and there's a couple thoughts I'm having. One intervention where, when I do these interviews, what people say to me is, "Oh my God, I've really never thought this through. I've never said these words before. I've never put these pieces together in this way before." And so telling the narrative gives her some different way to process all these barriers and restrictions, or to create meaning. So creating meaning is what I think a therapeutic intervention is about. Now, in Western psychiatry, we would do that through our counseling techniques, which have to do with speaking your truth and telling people how you feel, and those are, as I said, distasteful in the Japanese mind. So finding new ways to help people create meaning without necessarily having to do it in such an abrupt or rude or crude way. That's one thing. And then the other thing is I'm working with a Korean researcher right now in New York State, and she actually is working on logotherapy, which is a meaning therapy. And again, very useful in the Japanese mind, that you can sort of reframe, actually. This is, this regret or this perceived barrier may not be a barrier, or there are other avenues to get out of this box.
So I think we're going to try and take one more question given the hour, but there seems to be a lot of interest. We had a question here or comment?
For a good number of years, I've been teaching English to primarily Japanese women, and I have a couple of friends that I do things with out of class, and I asked them would they like to come to this program, and I'd like your responses to the reaction I got from the one lady. Her kids go to U of M, one's in law school, and they're a very education-oriented family. But I told her about this, and I said, would you like to come? And she said, the first thing was, oh, it's too sad. No, I don't want to learn about that. And the second one was, Korea has a higher rate than we do.
So a comment was made for the record that one of the audience participants had a friend who she invited to the program this afternoon, and asked what she thought about. And one said that would be too sad. I don't want to hear about that. She'd like a comment about that. And the other comment was that well, depression is so much more common in Japan. So, I'm sorry, in Korea than in Japan. So, and I guess she's seeking comments from all of you.
Actually, the youth suicide rate is exactly the same in South Korea and Japan. Overall rate is slightly higher in Korea, and you can find these statistics very easily by just looking at national or global suicide statistics, and you'll find the recent data. The highest the highest suicide rate is in actually Greenland, believe it or not, and then Russia. Yep.
It's been interesting to do research on the topic of depression and distress, considering that kind of feeling. So helping people talk about something so painful is an extreme challenge, right? So even just the idea of thinking about something so painful, when I was listing the restrictions about asking for help or talking about, I mean, the first one is I'm not even going to think about it. We had some interesting discussion in our research team years ago about, why is it that people won't talk about depression? And we were toying with this idea that when you talk about it in the Japanese mind, it kind of makes it so. So if you don't talk about it, somehow it isn't present. So there's just, it's just this sense of the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a invading force in our health, or a risk even, almost like if you can imagine, you've seen some of the Japanese anime, that sort of black cloud that just comes into your body. So the more you don't talk about it, the more protected you are from that. So there's definitely that sense, that cloud hanging over our interviews, and people not wanting to hear what I have to say because it's making it real and threatening.
People, they don't start talking, I'm depressed. They don't. They hide it. And I guess the one reason being exposing your inner feeling is exposing weakness. So they don't want to do that. That's probably the big factor. I see a lot of patients every day, and they don't tell me they are depressed at all, but they keep coming every 3 days for runny nose and cough, can't sleep, headache. And then you really have to kind of be aware that, by the way, how's your husband? By the way, are you sleeping okay at night? And then she started saying, well, I can't sleep. What's happening? To tell the truth. Or all of a sudden, like that. Whoa, what happened? I hit the button. And then they start to talk about, well, my husband don't come home and I think he has a girlfriend or something like that, and start to come out. And then I slowly get into that and pull all the problems. And then huge, big problems really comes out. Really amazing. All sorts of mask depression. People will not tell you, particularly Japanese people won't. But you really have to be aware all the time when you talk to the people that, are you happy? Are you doing all right? Everything going okay? And is the husband coming home early enough? Or is the kids doing okay at school? You keep asking. So you really get a little small clue of what's behind. Then, so that's the thing. So as a frontline clinician, we really have to know those exist, depression exists, and keep searching or keep throwing little clue. And that's important. And then whenever you see something going behind, you really have to jump on it. Otherwise, who knows? I have a couple of patients and commit suicide. I didn't know. He did not tell me depressed. But the next week, his picture was on the newspapers. Whoa, he didn't tell me. That's so sad. So really, that's what we have to do as a primary care and caregiver.
Professor Zucker, do you want to add anything? So it struck me, there's a saying in Japanese, because you asked, well, we can't go, it's too hard to talk about. bad. And there's a saying, kusaimona ni futo suru, so keep a lid on that which smells. And so you just, the question I think is, can we create more dialogue with people? Can we open up? Can we help people to be able to verbalize more those things that are inside of them that are really hard to express, and are those things that we can intervene on both as friends and as, I'm a clinician, but these people are also our friends, or our relatives, or our colleagues, and is there a way that we can better reach out to those? And so I kind of planted that seed in part as a segue to the events tomorrow, which will be in English again, and on Saturday, which will be in Japanese, where we'll go through the documentary by Renee Dignan, and Professor Teo will also be giving some information about, well, what should you do if this kind of thing comes up, or you suspect it? How can you get beyond that barrier of those social walls and the social isolation to work with them? Because we want to move the conversation upstream, because when it gets so close, it can be very unpredictable when something can happen. So I'd really like to extend my greatest thanks to the panel discussants today, and all of you. Thank you very much for coming.